Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be talking about reading like a writer. You might be familiar with the book Reading Like a Writer by Francine Prose. Fantastic book. I encourage everybody to read it. But today I'm going to give you my take on what I do to kind of analyze fiction and really get into it. Nonfiction's a little bit different, but I do reread nonfiction as well. But with fiction specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I think you can do to really get in there and look at a book and analyze it in a way that helps you become a better writer. So one of the first things I do, and it's very simple, and yet I meet a lot of people who say they don't do it at all, is I reread. I reread these books behind me. I own them because I love them and I want to read them again. And just like a movie, I love to watch them and read them over and over. There's several books in my collection that I've read many times. Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, I've probably read about 7 or 8 times. I've enjoyed it every time, and there's something new that I pick up on every time I read it, and things that I forget, especially because I think I've seen the movie more than I've read the books, and so I forget that there's certain things that are in the books, and then it just makes it more fun because I'm like, oh yeah, the movie was missing so much. So I also like to reread just to really understand what the author was trying to do. I go in after I've read the first time, I go back and I go, oh, look what the author was trying to set up here, or look at the 3-act structure, or this is a really interesting way to do a character. I also like to reread because there's books that have great kind of like twists or endings where things start to make sense, and then I want to go back and reread again, like The Thief by Megan Wallen Turner. I've read that several times, but the first time I finished it, I immediately wanted to read it again because everything made sense. And I really thought that was a very interesting way of writing a story. And if you read it, you'll know what I'm talking about. And if you have read it, please tell me about it. I'd love to talk to you about it. It's one of my favorite series. You also have to think about it like a movie with like hidden Easter eggs. Books are full of hidden Easter eggs that the author has very carefully inserted into their stories that you might not pick up on the first time you read it. You watch a movie, it's got all these hidden Easter eggs behind it, and so the second time you watch it, you pick up on some subtle things. The third time, you're like, oh, I never saw that before. You start to kind of engage in a different way with the movie. You already know this plot, you already know what's going to happen, so now you're engaging with it differently. You're looking at other things besides the main characters when they're talking, and that's what rereading does for me. When I reread, I am seeing more than just the plot and the characters. I'm also prone to sometimes, it's my lunch break, I'll pull off a book off my shelf and just start reading in the middle or read at my favorite part. And I think that that's a great way to kind of get into a story and really think about it in a different way than how you did with the first time you just passed through. Another thing I like to do is I like to read books that really aren't my thing. Books that maybe aren't in a genre that I particularly enjoy, or books that are on a subject that maybe I'm not super interested in, but I want to know some of the information that's in it. Reading those books can help you figure out your craft and also help you in areas where you might be struggling. I really struggle with romance in my books. I don't particularly love romance, and I'm not a super romantic person. I don't read romantic books very often, but sometimes it's necessary, and sometimes your characters fall in love, and that's okay. And I find myself having to go down that path of romance. I might actually pull out some books that maybe aren't my kind of thing just to get into it or engage with it. I also read a lot of children's literature that isn't really my type of thing. Books with talking animals, for example. I've never been a big fan of talking animals, but I will read those books just to see what they're about. If they're written by a really, well-known writer who I really enjoy their other books, I might read it anyways. I enjoy books that have nuance, and that's what I'm looking for when I'm reading books that maybe aren't my thing, is I'm looking for how the writer did it, or what they're engaging with, what are their in-doubt objects, where did the plot and the pacing come from, is it character driven, is it plot driven? So I do typically read books that I don't love as much. I read them a little slower because I'm usually reading them more for analysis than I am for enjoyment. And sometimes they surprise me and I enjoy them anyways. For example, My Life with a Liar by Kayla Carter is a fantastic book and not one that I normally pick up, but it was in an advanced reader pile of books I could pick up. And I thought, well, this sounds kind of interesting and, I'll read it. And I loved it. I loved it and I bought it and I kept it on my bookshelf. So, you never know what you're going to find when you read books that maybe aren't your thing. Another thing that you can do is you can read your books out loud. I read some of my favorite books to my husband and to my kid. But the reason I do that is because not only do I want to share something I love with the people that I love, just like a movie, and books are a little different, so I can't just like pop in a movie and be like, let's watch this. Books are different. I have to read them to them or they have to read it. And so sometimes I read them out loud and we just kind of enjoy a book together as a family. But doing it that way also means that I now have somebody I can talk to about that book and I can bring it up in conversation. I know that when I went to my MFA program for writing, we had a core curriculum or a list of books that we all needed to read. And the reason why those books were required is that anytime we're in a lecture, anytime you're talking to each other in a workshop, somebody could bring up that book and you could all start discussing it and start analyzing it because you've all read it and you're all familiar with it. And so that is a great way of kind of, being able to analyze something with somebody else. If you're the kind of person who likes to talk it out, which I am, I think that it's a good way to interact with people with books that can feel so private sometimes. And I think Harry Potter, again, is a good example of a book that's brought a lot of people together because so many people have read it and so many people can talk about it. Same thing with The Diary of a Wimpy Kid. These books have kind of become part of our lexicon and part of our culture. And they're good ways to analyze a book as well. Another thing I want to talk about, and I actually have an example here, is marginalia. Now, if you don't know what marginalia is, it's basically the act of writing in your books, which I know some of you are like, oh, no, I can never do that. I can't write in my books. Just so you know, a lot of famous writers have done this for years. John Adams, Oscar Wilde, Edgar Allan Poe did it, Mark Twain. They had a tendency to write in books. A lot of the famous quotes that we have of John Adams actually comes from the marginalia that he wrote in books. So he'd get a book that was like a political book and they would be talking about America and he would go in there and write his opinions on there, sometimes very angrily, and then send the book back, like, here's my thoughts, almost like blogging back at the people. And so there's these really great quotes that he has. So I talked before about how Dune is one of my favorite books. I think it's dense and it's got a lot of information to get into, but I've read it several times, and it was a book that my dad loved. So when I was a kid, we talked about Dune a lot, and I have written in my book. I have index cards in here. I have highlighted things that I think are interesting. I have written revelations, notes. Sometimes they're goofy, sometimes they mean nothing. I ask questions. I say, Thufir Hawat, is this character necessary? Which is a different note from a different time when I wrote something about the Reverend Mother. I wrote throughout this whole book. There's lots of marginalia in this book, and different pencils and pens, so you can tell that I did them at different times with different readings. That is a way for me to also analyze and think about a story while I'm in the moment. I do typically buy a larger format of a book so that I have room to write in the margins. And you can have more than one book. I have several copies of Dune. I think, is it available up here? I have one up here that is very nice, and I would never write in it. So this is my writing book. That one is not. That one's for display and for borrowing purposes. I have actually lent this one out too. I like marginalia. I don't do it in all my books, but I do it in the ones that I really want to analyze, and I'm interested in studying the writing and how it's done. Something else that I do is sticky notes. Sticky notes. So this is rules. I have obviously analyzed this book a lot. I can't even tell you now what all these colors meant at the time, but they did mean something. I was definitely analyzing something. And there's a lot of it. And I had probably had a key when I did it, something that said, this is what I'm looking for in the book. Same thing, The Schwa Was Here by Neil Shusterman, which if you've read Neil Shusterman, I think that he has written many great books, but this is my favorite. And I have analyzed it so much, and it's so funny. So what I was analyzing, and this one was humor in middle grade fiction. And I was really trying to look at how humor is used and the different types of humor that is used throughout this book, because there's several kinds in here. It's not just direct, sometimes it's subtle. And so I was trying to find that within the pages and of the book. There's no marginalia. I didn't write in the book. I wrote on the stickies. And I was really interested. I've got stars on the parts that I really thought were interesting. And again, I need a key now. I'd have to go back and find my notes when I was doing the analyzation of this book. I know that this seems like a lot of work. I mean, this is a lot of work. But what this did was help me understand the way that humor can be used in middle grade fiction and the different ways that it can be used. It was a good example, and it was one that I was able to pull from, and it really helped with my writing. So there's no one way to do this. You can analyze books in many different ways, but if you're going to be a great writer, then you need to start looking at other people's writing and figuring out what works, what doesn't work, what are the different styles, what are the different ways that you can do something. This might not be your type of humor. The Schwa Was Here, but it is mine. And so it really played into that, and I was able to really kind of get into it and delve deep into that book, because that was one of my favorites. And so just like I've said in several videos before, you need to pull out your favorite books off of your bookshelves or get them from the library. Don't write in them if they're from the library. And really start to analyze them in a way that's a little different. You don't have to do this for every book, but do it for a few books. Do it for the books that are going to help with the writing that you're working on now. If you're working on a high fantasy story, pull out a really good high fantasy story that is not exactly like yours, because none of them are going to be exactly like yours. One that it really speaks to you and you've engaged with before, and reread it, or put sticky notes on it, or read it out loud to your family and talk about the characters and how it's done. Or if you can bring yourself to do it, write in the margins. Ask questions to yourself as the reader that help you and kind of inform you in your writing. And keep reading. Just keep reading. You don't have to read a ton of books. If you're a slow reader, that's fine. Listen to audiobooks. And just remember that as a writer, part of our job is to create good stories. And the best way to do that is to also learn as we go. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to our channel. We post new writing tip videos every Friday for all types of writers. I've been Venus at Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.